Okay, William. So, even though a day at the races sounds like it was a hell of an experience in more ways than one back in those days, you weren't necessarily going to go back with all you went with, and that wasn't just the money you lost to the bookmakers.
No, indeed not. Going to the races could be quite an adventure, and not always a pleasant one, because inevitably a crowd of people in those days, and especially after the advent of the railways, there was almost a whole tribe of people who went from meeting to meeting. Um, and even in fact, on the way to the races, on the way home to the races, from the races rather, particularly in the 18th century, is of course there was the prospect of being attacked by highwaymen. A number of these courses, especially around London, were held, in what was then quite distant, and people would be riding 20 or 30 miles. So particularly the worst meetings for highwaymen was that at Maidenhead, when it was on Maidenhead Thicket, the race meeting, um, discussed in volume two, and the thicket was a very large, rough area round Maidenhead then. Obviously, most of it's gone now, and it was notorious for highwaymen. The other two meetings that were notorious were Barnet in Hertfordshire. Coming back to London, a number of people were robbed from the races because they knew they were sort of people who carry money and maybe had won money. And the other one was Hounslow, to the west of London, pretty much under the sort of runway of just east of the runway of Heathrow Airport. And again, Hounslow Heath was notorious for. So it wasn't even, before you even got to the races or after the races, you weren't necessarily safe. On the race course, there were the huge tribes of pickpockets, and these were not just urchins having a bit of a go. They were quite well organized gangs, and there was a sort of head pickpocket quite often on each course. Later, of course, there were the infamous people who've watched Peaky Blinders. There were the Razor gangs, the Birmingham Boys, and everything else. And anybody who's watched Brighton Rock, there were these organized gangs in the 1930s, but we're talking about a century before then, and right up to the 1880s. And one of the things was there was the head pickpocket, and he would organize quite a few of these pickpockets. And one of their wheezes was that if you lost your watch to a pickpocket, you could buy it back by going to the head pickpocket and doing so. And one of the things, and one of the Weatherby family, who was, of course, the administrators of racing by then, he went to the races, and one race meeting, he lost his pocket watch, of which he was relatively fond, and uh, so he went to the head pickpocket and said, "Look, is there any chance of buying it back?" He knew the form, and the chief pickpocket said, "That'll be £10." So without batting an eyelid. So he bought back his watch. Anyway, went to another race meeting and lost the watch again to a pickpocket. Went to the leading pickpocket there, £10, please. And so he got the watch back again. Anyway, he went to a third race meeting and lost it. And the head pocket of that race course, who probably the same one as the previous, went to him and said, "Would he like it back?" And he said, "No, I've lost it twice. The third time, you can have it." And so he didn't pay. Another example of this was one of the great characters of Victorian racing was a man called Sir John Astley, um, who was known as the mate, and he was an enormous man. But he did once ride in a race where each horse carried 16 stone, which is quite a thought. And he always talked about himself in the third person. He was an MP, incidentally, for Brigg in Lincolnshire for a short time. Didn't attend very often, and when he was asked about Sir Wilfrid and about Sir Wilfrid's, mine's a deuce sight too high, which was not quite what the question had asked him, really. But so anyway, Sir John he lost his watch and went to see the head pickpocket, who and he said to him, "See here, they've taken Sir John's watch. This is too much. It's too much." And so the head pickpocket said, "Oh, excuse me, Sir John." And off he went. And an hour later came back with the watch, no fee, because Sir John was so popular with everybody. And he said, "I'm so sorry, Sir John. I do apologize. The boy is new to the profession." And so Sir John got his watch back. And, it was the constant thievery. And not only would they be thieving, but they would, if they, most race courses were open to most people. The only people who paid were those who went on the stand. And they would, of course, then be a collection of people who would be worth robbing. And on more than one occasion, the roughs ganged up and assaulted the stand. There would be a few sort of security people, a few constables possibly, and they assaulted the stand. And they did this at Brecon races. No, sorry, it was Monmouth races. And a little man called Dyke, he was actually a dwarf, ran the races. And the main patron of the races, the owner of a lot of land around Monmouth at the time, was the Duke of Beaufort. And the Duke of Beaufort of the day, he was in the stand and he was involved in this assault, as he was assaulted, as it were. And little Dyke, there was this little voice, "For God's sake, save the Duke!" Like this. In fact, the Duke was having a rip-roaring time. He loved a good punch-up, and so he and his the roughs got more than they bargained for, because the Duke had clearly spent more time at Eton learning how to being beaten by Keat probably, or Hawtrey, and was a pretty tough nut. And he saw, and the great gang saw off the roughs, pinned a few of them to the ground, and had them arrested. And of course, probably a few days later, guess who they'd be before? The Duke, probably. So it probably wasn't a great wheeze for the putative thieves. So yes, and quite a few, and especially when some of the meetings started to ask for gate money. West Drayton, which is long discussed in Volume 1, run by an extraordinary character called Count Bolo, whose real name was George French. And people actually swum a river in order to try and bust their way through the protection of keeping the West Drayton and not having to pay. And the same with the Manchester racecourse too. People actually swam the River Earl, which is a pretty big river, in order to avoid paying. And they would then rush the turnstiles. And there was one meeting in Wales where, in fact, they cleverly, in theory, built a bridge that people had to go over to get there. But the people bust up the bridge, and the bridge collapsed, so everybody went into the river.
So flimping in is nothing new.
No.